The Society of United Irishmen, founded as a radical or liberal political organisation in 18th century Ireland, initially sought parliamentary reform. It evolved into a revolutionary republican organisation, inspired by the American Revolution and allied with revolutionary France. It launched the Irish Rebellion of 1798, with the objective of ending British monarchical rule over Ireland and founding a sovereign, independent Irish Republic. On the day of the 23rd of May, there was a smell of rebellion in the air at the Grand Canal. 500 rebels had assembled there throughout the day, waiting on the command to attack the 2 regiments of British soldiers quartered in Prosperous. But what triggered the events that took place, and how did the days leading up to the 23rd of May escalate to the very first attacks of the 1798 rebellion? Prosperous was founded in 1780 by a man called Sir Robert Brooke. He married in 1775 Anna Maria Mapletoft, daughter of Reverend Robert Mapletoft, assistant chaplain to the East India Company at St. John's, Calcutta. They had 5 sons and 2 daughters. Her family home is where the parochial house is located in the village and was then known as Mapletoft Hall. Brooke was born in Rathaven House, County Cavan, and entered the service of the East India Company in 1764 as a cadet aged 20. After a career in military administration in India, he took sick leave and moved to County Kildare in Ireland. He attempted to establish a cotton industry in the area, and the town of Prosperous owes its origin to the vision and ideals of Robert Brooke. The late 18th century was a time of attempted industrial development in Ireland, and the industry upon which Prosperous was founded in 1780 was cotton manufacturing. The name chosen by Brooke for his industrial town could only be the product of a confident dream. Within 6 years it had failed miserably. He spent his own money, that of his wife, and the grants he received from Grattan's Parliament. His losses were almost the equivalent of the national debt. He employed almost 4,000 by 1784, yet by 1786 the works and all his remaining property had to be abandoned to his creditors. In the end, the different departments were sold privately to those who could afford to, and they in turn hired the people to work. But it never reached the scale of the dreams of Robert Brooke or the people of the area. During April and May 1798, the government tried to forcibly disarm the Kildare United Irishmen. Captain Richard Longford Swain of the North Cork Militia arrived in Prosperous on the 20th of May for this purpose, only days before the rebellion took place. Local man Bernard Duggan wrote that Swain immediately applied free quarters and began to round up and torture suspects. On his arrival to Prosperous on the 21st of May, Swain and his men immediately paid a visit to the local church while local priest Father Higgins was saying Mass. Swain and his troops began to roughen up members of the congregation as part of their search for suspected United Irishmen, weapons, and blacksmiths. Swain even went as far as bringing Father Higgins to his knees on the altar and threatened to pour boiling lead down his throat if he didn't do his part in pointing out any potential suspects. The Battle of Prosperous was the first battle of 1798, and from here it would spread like ignited gunpowder through the county of Kildare and into Wicklow and Wexford. The Battle of Prosperous was certainly hastened by the actions of Captain Richard Swain of the Cork Militia and his torturing of the people of the village. Pitch capping was introduced by the Cork Militia. This type of torture was principally intended for persons who wore their hair cropped short and who for that reason were supposed to be in sympathy with the United Irishmen. In most cases there was no trial. Suspects were simply seized and brought to the guardhouse, where a cap of coarse linen was then smeared on the inside with hot pitch and compressed on their heads. It was then allowed to cool in order that it could not be easily pulled off. The pitch cap was then set alight, resulting in further anguish of melting pitch trickling down into their eyes. The blinded victims frequently fell or inadvertently dashed their heads against walls in their way. The pain of trying to disengage this pitch cap from the head was next to intolerable. The hair was often torn out by the roots, and frequently parts of the scalp would come off along with it. What should surprise most people is that this type of torture was carried out in the open day. If a pitch cap was not readily available, then moistened gunpowder was rubbed into their hair and then set on fire. There were 12 men arrested and lodged in the guardhouse of Prosperous on the 23rd in order to be executed on the 24th without judge or jury under Swain's command. He burned 15 houses indiscriminately and picketed one man on the same day. The torture of these men became a popular amusement among the soldiers. A sergeant in the Cork militia nicknamed Tom the Devil was apparently very resourceful in devising new methods of torture. Other methods of torture were scourging, picketing, half-hanging, and the cutting off of ears and noses. According to the words of the Battle of Prosperous, they even murdered an entire family of a suspected local rebel who was on the run and hiding in the bogs nearby. The people all around Prosperous suffered at the hands of the tyrannical Captain Richard Swain and the Cork militia, who plundered and almost laid waste to the entire district. Swain only spent 2 days in the village of Prosperous, but during that time he burned, hunted, flogged, picketed, and pitch-capped the locals. His actions certainly pushed the people of Prosperous to hasten the start of the 1798 rebellion. What we know of Swain from Youghal in Cork is that he came from a very distinguished military family, so he had a lot to prove if he was to stand in the great military leader footsteps of his father and his brothers. It was well known amongst the villagers of Prosperous that there were many members of the United Irishmen residing in the area. Some were farmers, cotton manufacturers, blacksmiths, and others were infiltrators in the local yeomanry. The local yeomanry were under orders to seek out the local rebels and obtain as many names as they could of suspected rebels. One member of this yeomanry was a young doctor called John Esmond. John Esmond of Osborstown was the most prominent Kildare rebel to be executed for his role in the 1798 rebellion. His case illustrates the complexity of the late 18th century Irish political landscape. He was a member of the Catholic landed gentry, a doctor, a Catholic political activist, a United Irishman, a yeoman, and ultimately a condemned rebel and traitor. He was portrayed as a misguided or benevolent gentleman, motivated by the suffering of his neighbours which allowed his passion overcome his discretion. However, if Esmond is placed within the context of radical political activity during the 1790s, his role in the rebellion begins to make more sense. John Esmond was the second son of Sir James Esmond, Baronet of Ballinastra near Gorey, County Wexford. Little is known about his early life except for he trained as a doctor. He took up residence in Kildare in 1783 and married Helen Callan of Osborstown. Esmond was a prominent Catholic political activist in County Kildare in the early 1790s. He was one of a delegation which presented a petition to the Duke of Leinster in March 1792, seeking his support for the Catholic Relief Campaign. He was subsequently elected to represent Kildare at the Catholic Convention or Black Lane Parliament in December 1792. Moreover, John Esmond was a member of the Dublin Society of United Irishmen in 1792. John Esmond was a prominent radical politician with connections to like-minded associates in Dublin. In October 1796, the Clane Cavalry was established and commanded by Richard Griffith of Millicent, with John Esmond as his first lieutenant. However, there was a disagreement between Henry Stamers and Griffith. The former hoped to establish a yeomanry in Prosperous, which threatened Griffith's local hegemony. Esmond's role in the politics in County Kildare in the year before the 1798 rebellion is less clear. In January 1798, his yard at Osberstown was searched for arms, and under his direction a number of houses in the neighbourhood were also searched, but nothing was found, which is hardly surprising if Esmond was still a United Irishman. At a meeting on the 18th of March, in the dangerous aftermath of the arrest of the Leinster provincial delegates at Oliver Bond's house, Esmond replaced Thomas Reynolds as treasurer of the Kildare United Irishmen. On the evening of the 23rd of May, John Esmond requested a dinner meeting with Captain Swain. He told Swain that the local rebels had promised to surrender their weapons under the cover of darkness, only if Swain ordered his men to stand down so they could surrender their weapons on the street and not be recognised. Swain, after a few drinks, naively agreed to these terms, and word was sent back to the rebels at the 18th lock that they were to commence their attack on both of the barracks in the centre of the village that very night. On the 23rd of May, 500 rebels under the command of Captain Andrew Farrell gathered at the 18th lock at the Grand Canal just outside of Prosperous. They waited patiently there throughout the day and for word of safe passage into the village to commence their attack. Once John Esmond had delivered the word to Farrell and his men, they began their march to Prosperous. As they slowly approached the village under the cover of darkness at around 1 a.m, the rebels saw that indeed all sentinels were stood down and in their quarters. The street was quiet and dark, and as they slowly and silently reached the barracks, they spotted 2 soldiers keeping watch. A handful of rebels silently approached the guards from behind, and with bloody revenge in mind, they took out both sentinels without a sound. The rebels had obtained bundles of sticks and furs, which had been stored nearby, and they were set alight and thrown through the windows of the barracks. Once the sleeping soldiers inside woke up to the smell of smoke, they proceeded to run down the stairs and out the front door. Unfortunately for them, they were met by hundreds of rebels looking to exact their revenge. Some soldiers were shot or piked, and others ran back up the stairs through the smoke and the flames. According to the Battle of Prosperous words, a man named O'Hanlon, whose wife, baby, mother and father, who were all murdered by the British soldiers, dashed through the smoke, fire and flames. And as the song goes, then with one well-directed blow, O'Hanlon burst the door, and up the stairs to Swain's bedroom in frenzied wrath he tore, and there his Myra's murderer sat half-dressed upon the bed. The ready pike quick found his heart, the tyrant dropped back dead. 2 local women were also very influential in bringing down the Cork militia barracks. One woman was called Tobin, and the other was a young woman called Ruth Hackett. What we know of Ruth Hackett is that she carried lit bundles of sticks and furs from across the street of the barracks out to the rebels. She shielded herself using an old thin mattress. During one of her crossings, a red coat bullet pierced the mattress and went through her chest, and she died in the middle of the street. At this point, the barracks where the Welsh fencibles lay was also under attack and in flames. The British soldiers begged for the release and survival of their wives and children, and this request was hastily granted. As the barracks was completely covered in flames, British soldiers had one of 3 choices: run through the fire and try to escape out the front door, stay in the barracks and burn to death, or jump through the windows onto the blades of the pikes that the rebels held high in the air. Of both regiments, approximately 11 soldiers managed to get away and ran as fast as they could in the direction of Clane, where at this point an attack had just begun. As for Captain Swain, his dead and bloodied body was dragged into the street, and his remains were burned in a barrel of tar to joyous cheers and applause. The rebels exclaimed that the day was their own and they would plant the Tree of Liberty. One eyewitness named Thomas Davis stated that a small group of rebels knocked at his door, expecting to find a party of soldiers who had been billeted there a short time before, and a Mr. Stamers, who would occasionally lodge there when he came to receive his rents. Part of the town of Prosperous belonged to Stamers. Davis also stated that soon after a Mr. Brewer, a respectable manufacturer of the town who had employed many of the rebels, had been massacred by them, and that his body had been mangled with savage barbarity. They also massacred a poor old man of the age of 70 years, who served as a sergeant in His Majesty's forces. Having considered him as an Orangeman though, Thomas Davis was convinced that the only reason why the rebels murdered the sergeant was his being a Protestant. Once the rebels had committed these barbarities, they exclaimed with savage joy, "Where are the heretics now? Show us the face of an Orangeman. The kingdom is our own, for Dublin and Naas have been taken and are in possession of our friends. Down with the heretics, down with the Orangemen." There is a site in Prosperous next to Ann Street known as the Dead Field. According to writings, this is the site where the dead British soldiers were laid to rest, and have laid there ever since. One of the Prosperous guardhouses belonged to the landlord of the town, who was a magistrate and as great a loyalist that could live, namely Henry Stamers, Esquire. When a small group of rebels stormed the house of Thomas Davis, they were looking for Stamers. When they realised he wasn't present, they made their way to Downing's house, home of widow Alice Bonning, after acting on a tip-off. They reached Downing's house and immediately made their way in and met Alice Bonning in the main hallway. They demanded that she tell them the whereabouts of Stamers. She insisted that he was not present and that she had not seen him for many days. The rebels threatened to burn down her home if she didn't give him up. A passing servant in the house secretly informed the rebels that Stamers had been seen minutes before running to the underground vaults under the house. The rebels dashed to the vault under the house and found Stamers hiding in a dark corner, in an attempted disguise, wearing a milkmaid's outfit. The rebels dragged him out and piked him to death at the top of the steps that lead down to the basement. This part of the original Downing's house still exists today and is known as Stamers' Vault. The rebels cleared the house of all occupants and servants and set Downing's house on fire. One of Alice Bonning's more loyal servants took her by horse and carriage in the direction of Naas along the Grand Canal. Only 2 kilometres from her blazing home, it is said that looking over her shoulder as she crossed the Grand Canal at the bridge at Landonstown on her way to Salins, she saw in the distance Downing's house on fire, lighting up the sky in a gloomy redness. This was the final act of the rebels in the Battle of Prosperous on the 24th of May. Dr. John Esmond, who masterminded the whole attack, actually never took part in the battle for fear of being recognised. He positioned himself just outside of the village on his horse in the area of Currabell. After the Battle of Prosperous, he rode to Naas to Captain Griffith's yeomanry with his aide-de-camp Phil Might from the Cock Bridge. When they reached the contingent, Might placed a piece of paper into the hand of Captain Griffith, informing him of Esmond's role in masterminding the attack. Esmond was later jailed and sentenced to death by hanging from Carlisle Bridge in Dublin, known today as O'Connell Bridge. He was hung with his coat turned inside out as a message to what would happen to any future turncoats. On Tuesday the 19th of June 1798, almost 4 weeks on from the Battle of Prosperous, a 3-pronged attack was launched against the rebels in North Kildare and their stronghold, the village of Prosperous. Colonel Irwin led a strong force of nearly 400 men, composed of Highlanders, Dragoon Guards, and 4 troops of yeoman cavalry out from Kilcock to cut off any possible retreat of the rebels to the north of the village and to support 2 other attacks that were directed towards Prosperous from the south and west. On their march towards the bogs, lying to the north of Prosperous, the troops unexpectedly came upon a large rebel camp near Ovidstown. This was the main North Kildare rebel force under the command of Colonel William Aylmer. A battle ensued, with the rebels suffering a crushing defeat along with a great number of casualties. Meanwhile, Captain Pack of the 5th Dragoon Guards had advanced on Prosperous from Rathangan. He came up against 100 of the rebels, well mounted and appointed, clothed mostly in yeomanry uniforms. He instantly launched an attack and defeated them, taking 8 horses and killing between 20 to 30 men. The third attack was delivered directly against the village by Lord Castlereagh's brother, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stewart. This force marched out from Naas with men from the City of Cork and Armagh Militia, the Suffolk Fencibles, the Royal Irish, the 9th and North Naas Dragoons, and 2 curricle guns. On arrival at Prosperous, his troops noticed rebels on a hill to the left. Stewart wrote, "Yesterday at Prosperous, County Kildare, an action took place in which that town has been nearly consumed by fire. The rebels assembled in great force but were defeated with proportionate slaughter. They were headed by a person of the name of Aylmer, to whom a fellow named Lynch, lately residing in Lucan, acted as aide-de-camp. A standard, or a flag, was hoisted by the rebels. It was made of green serge with a yellow cross in the centre, and underneath, as if worked on a ribbon, the words Éireann go Bragh. This ensign of the rebellion, together with the hand of him who held it, was shot away. The rebels fled down into the village and to the bog to the rear of it. The advance guard, on approaching the village, was fired on by the rebels from the windows of the houses and was ordered to fall back. The colonel over the City of Cork militia had a private vendetta against the rebels of Prosperous, who had killed so many of his men, including his relative Captain Swain. Stewart positioned the 2 curricle guns on the road, protected by the cavalry and the infantry, and fired on the village. He remarked, "The rebels soon fled into the bog, and I ransacked and burnt this receptacle of a rebellion." The soldiers found many cattle penned up, pikes in abundance, and even some drums. Stewart lamented that his orders prevented him from following the rebels into the hills, which, he felt, stopped the troops from proving their worth. Without local knowledge of the immense bogs of North Kildare, it would have been perilous for the king's forces to try to engage the rebels on such unpredictable terrain. This force returned to Naas, and Prosperous was once again in rebel hands. The following is a reenactment by members of Prosperous Drama Group of the report of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stewart.
Pray tell us, sir, are those awful rumours of a defeat of our forces in Kildare to be deemed true?
I'm afraid so, sir. I believe it was a place named Prosperous in County Kildare, under the charge of Captain Swain of the Cork Militia. And our losses were apparently quite considerable. It seems that the rebels were led by a lieutenant in the yeomanry, a local man, named Esmond, I believe.
Preposterous! To think that our superior forces could so easily be defeated at the hands of a rag-taggled bunch of peasants who never before had faced the enemy in the field.
Ridiculous.
Outrageous. Quite outrageous and bloody embarrassing.
Sirs, I have with me a report on the events at Prosperous.
Oh, very good.
On the 23rd of May, it was intimated that fear had hitherto prevented the peasantry from bringing the concealed weapons to the town, and that should they be permitted to enter after dark unchallenged and unmolested on the following night, pikes and firearms would be brought in and deposited in the streets. It is difficult to decide whether the stupidity of Swain or the treachery of Esmond were most to be condemned. A man individually may trifle with himself, but for him who turns right or left from the plain path which duty points to, and compromises the safety of those committed to his charge, his men, there can be no extenuation.
Absolutely.
For Swain's folly there can be no apology.
Absolutely.
His guards should have been doubled. A cart or a ladder drawn across the street would have marked sufficiently where those who came to surrender arms might approach with full security.
Right.
A step beyond it, if the challenge failed, the advanced sentry would shoot the intruder and the garrison would at once be alarmed. So much for Swain. His weakness was inexcusable. He died its victim, ignobly, certainly, but still by the weapon of a foe man. Esmond met the doom he merited, a noose. About 2 o'clock on Thursday morning, the 24th of May, the 2 sentinels were surprised and killed, and both barracks were assaulted while the soldiers were fast asleep. Nothing could have been more detestable than Esmond's treachery. He wore the royal uniform, and yet was false to the monarch to which he had sworn allegiance. When men of desperate fortune swerve from the paths of honour, poverty may be pleaded to extenuate, though not excuse. Esmond had no plea to offer. He was wealthy, well-born, and respected. He might have proved a rebel, but why play the traitor? When in the house of God, loyalty was on his lips, while the heart was contemplating bloodshed. Even the tie a savage venerates could not turn him from his truculent design. And while he had devoted him to death, he shared his victim's hospitality. He dined with Captain Swain at the inn on the 23rd of May, and continued to enjoy the glow of social mirth with him till a few hours before the perpetration of that bloody scene, which he had for some time meditated. The work of death at Prosperous was interrupted by intelligence conveyed to the insurgents that at Clane, 3 miles off, their friends had been defeated. For although partly surprised, that little garrison succeeded in beating off their assailants. That is the end of my report.
Kildare, you say? I will get a message dispatched to Brigadier General Dunn in Monastreven and get him to send as many forces as he can to Prosperous. We'll teach these rebels a thing or two.
Sir, to the best of my knowledge, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stewart and Captain Pack of the 5th Dragoon Guards are in the vicinity, and I am certain that the Colonel has a number of curricle guns at his disposal.
Excellent.
Very good, very good.
In the context of the United Irishmen's Rebellion of 1798, the Battle of Prosperous on the 24th of May represents the very first shots fired and the first victory for the rebels. On that day, about 500 men with pikes, 8 had firelocks, 1 musket, 1 fusee, 5 pistols and 1 blunderbuss fought with incredible bravery. Despite its historical part in the rebellion of 1798, Prosperous fails to get a single word of any significance in terms of its part in the rebellion. It was said that if His Majesty's forces were to quash the rebellion of 98 once and for all, they would have to take the village of Prosperous and hold it.
The chapel bell at Prosperous was pealing loud and high. The weaver and the artisans in groups have gathered nigh. From Blackwood, from Downings, from Longtown and Denore, from Curry Hills and Landonstown those sturdy peasants pour, and matrons from Millerstown and maids from Currabell. The dread doings of those yeomen in shuddering horror tell, for those monsters of oppression and dark dishonour reign in that district long abandoned to the tyrant rule of Swain.